We continue with our podcast of the prophetic writing series. Today we're dealing with the book Jewish Apocalypticism, and we're speaking about the origination of Jewish Apocalypticism. We saw in our research that that Amos wrote the prototype for future Jewish Apocalypticism, and we've drawn up a table of 7 or 8 different elements of the Jewish apocalyptic events. And we show how these started with Amos, and then they were utilized by other prophets, and at times built on that and added elements, and that eventually the Amos's prototype was taken right through to the book of Revelation, and showing clearly that this was orchestrated from that time. We showed too that Amos took a bona fide prophecy of the crucifixion of Messiah, and he wasn't sure what he was dealing with. And he related it to the attack by the Assyrians, and we know in hindsight that it wasn't part of the Jewish apocalypticism, but was a portrayal of Messiah's crucifixion on the cross. And we believe that Amos actually took this bona fide prophecy probably from another prophet that wrote this and used it incorrectly to show what would occur. And Amos's prophetic elements were his impression of what would occur when the Assyrians attacked them. And he knew they were going to attack them because they refused to pay the tribute. And we see that they believed they had an arrangement with the Egyptians to come to their defense. But that never materialized, and they were taken captive, and many were led into exile, and many in the northern kingdom were crushed, and many of those tribes went into obscurity after that time. Now, the northern kingdom, the attack occurred around 722 BC, and we see that Amos prophesied around 730, 740 BC, and he started to speak of these various elements, bearing in mind that this is what he believed would occur when the Assyrians actually attacked them. So we see, first of all, one of the elements is the Lord will cause the heavens and earth to tremble when he ascends and causes the earth to melt and the valleys to split. And we see that's basically written in Amos 8:8 and 9, verse 1 and 5. It was copied by Micah 1:3-4, Nahum 1 verse 5, Isaiah 2:21, 13:4, 9 and 13, Jeremiah 4:24-28, 8:16, 10:10, and Zechariah 14:4-8, Enoch 1:3-7, and Revelation 16:18-20. So one can see that this concept went right through all these different writings, and they retained these elements that initiated with Amos's prophetic utterances. And then secondly, Amos states that God would judge the Israelites, the idolatrous Israelites, and the enemies of the Israelites. And we see that in Amos 1:2-3:8, and 7:7-8, and 9:1-4. And then again in Isaiah 13:1-16, 63 1-6, Zephaniah 1-18, Jeremiah 1:15 and 16, 5:15 and 17, 25, 12-33, Zechariah 14:1-3, and Joel 3:2-8. So we see that this judgment was it went through, and we see that later apocalypticists, after their Babylonian captivity, focused this judgment on the enemies of Israel, believing they had already been judged. So they reciprocated this judgment on their enemies. And we see this is shown in Ezekiel 39:8, Enoch 1:1-9, 56 5-8, Revelation 9:13-18, 16 17-21, 18:2-8, etc., etc. And then Amos spoke of the Israelites being attacked by a mighty army. And that was Amos 5:27, 7:9, 8:2-3, and it was taken up by Hosea 13:16, Isaiah 13:1-16, Jeremiah 23-6, Ezekiel 13:15, Enoch 56:5, Revelation 9:13-16, etc., etc. So we see these elements, these prophetic elements, went right through the prophetic writings, and we can see clearly what was taking place, that as the prophets emerged, they took these prior writings and they built on them, and they formulated their prophecies around them. And then Amos also speaks about the Lord will bring down fire on the earth on the day that he purportedly judges the idolatrous Israelites and their enemies. Amos 7 verse 4, Amos 1 1 to 2, 5, Micah, Nahum, Jeremiah, Joel, Isaiah, etc., etc. And we see that later apocalypticists saw the heavens and the earth being burnt with fire. They eventually saw total destruction. And we show in Jewish Apocalypticism that these signs and wonders got bigger and bigger and bigger as time went on. The original earthquake that happened with Messiah's crucifixion, they saw that getting bigger and bigger, and eventually in the book of Revelation, every island and every mountain is impacted by this earthquake. We also see that the darkness from noon eventually became the signs and the luminaries and the stars falling from heaven and the sky rolling up like a scroll. And these got bigger and bigger and bigger as time went on. So we see that these utterances by Amos were used by other peoples. And we see the concept of God treading the winepress. The winepress was originally spoken over the Israelites, and that was Jeremiah that wrote Lamentations 1:12 to 15. And then later Apocalypse took this and reciprocated this onto the enemies. And this was Ezekiel 32, 4 to 6, Isaiah 63, 1 to 4, Joel 3, 2, and then 3, 12 to 15, Enoch 100, verse 3, and Revelations 14, 20, and 19, 15. So we see that these things were written and they were copied and used by later prophets. And then we see also that Amos speaks about the great calamity which became the day of the Lord, and the great tribulation was spoken of in Amos 6:3, and also Hosea 1:4 to 5, Isaiah 13:6 to 13, Zephaniah 1:14 to 18, Jeremiah, etc., Obadiah, Zechariah, written in Enoch 56:5 to 6, Daniel 7:21, and Revelation 11:7 and 13:7. So we see all of these will be found in the book, all these different quotes. And also Amos wrote that the sinners of Israel would die on that day. And we see that in Amos 9:10, 6:8 to 9, 8:3, and of course followed up by Zephaniah, Isaiah, Ezekiel, Daniel, and in Revelations. And they just kept repeating those particular elements. But we see later prophets actually reciprocated these things that would first initially happen to the Israelites. They reciprocated onto the enemies of Israel. And we see that in Ezekiel 39, 1 to 8, Enoch 1, 1 to 9, Revelation 16, 21, 18, 1 to 8. And then we see that the final battle at Jezreel or Megiddo was written by Hosea, and that was shortly after the time of Amos. And Hosea had this impression that the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom would combine, and they would come against the Assyrians in the plains of Jezreel and defeat them. But of course that never happened. So that became one of the prophetic elements that the Jewish Apocalypticists clutched onto, and they repeated this, and it goes right through to the book of Revelation. And that's spoken of in Hosea 1 verse 11. It was then intimated in Ezekiel 39, 1 to 8 and verse 11. And then Enoch 56, 5 to 8, Revelation 16, 16. And we see that Amos spoke of a day of doom and gloom and darkness, and that the sun would be dark from noon. And that's spoken of in Amos 8 to 9. And initially, Amos spoke of it as a sad day. In other words, doom and gloom, sadness. And then he spoke of the darkness, and eventually it spoke of the signs in the sun and the moon and the stars falling from heaven. And that was repeated by Zephaniah 1:14 to 15, Isaiah 39 to 10, Jeremiah 4:24 to 28, Zechariah 14:6 to 7, Enoch 94 verse 9, Revelation 6:12 and 8:12. So we see these things got repeated. And what was happening, they were actually orchestrating the apocalyptic events. They had the framework, and they used prior frameworks and added to this as time developed. And we state that these signs in the heavens actually occurred when Messiah was crucified. That's from Amos 8, 7 to 10. And that what happened is they incorrectly put those signs into the apocalyptic expectation when in fact that prophetic utterance was speaking of the crucifixion of Messiah and shouldn't have been a part of these prophetic expectations. And in fact, if they removed that from their expectations, the initial occurrences that Amos spoke about would have actually come to pass, and there wouldn't have been any repetition of that. But because they were believing these, the earthquake and the sun to be dark and these various things, that they kept pushing these out to a later time. And I show in the book that on about 5 occasions, first with the Babylonian attack, and then with the attack on Jerusalem, and then later during the time of Antiochus Epiphanes, they believed it was going to happen. And then at the time of the church, when the temple was destroyed, they believed it was going to happen. And it was pushed out every time. And now it's sitting in the book of Revelation, and they're expecting that to happen at the end of the age. And we show that it won't happen because these prophecies aren't from God. They were actually orchestrated. And the initial prototype was actually incorrectly coupled with a bona fide prophecy of Messiah's crucifixion. So these things got bigger and bigger. And then, of course, it was the day of the bitter mourning for the only son. And that was actually the mourning for Messiah when he died on the cross. But they retained that as an apocalyptic expectation. And we show clearly that it's taken out of context. And that's not going to actually happen. And that's mentioned in Amos 8:10, Jeremiah 6:26, Isaiah 29, 1-2, Zechariah 12:10-11, and of course in Revelations 1:7 and 8:19. So we see that apocalyptic expectation, it wasn't apocalyptic, it referred to Messiah's crucifixion, and we show that clearly. Amos also spoke about the attack by locusts that would consume their crops, Amos 7, 1-2, and it's repeated with Joel 1-4, and again it's transposed into Revelation 9, 1-12, where these locusts are actually mentioned. We show that Joel, and most of the commentaries say that Joel was updated and mostly rewritten during the time of the Babylonian captivity. It focuses on the restoration of Jerusalem, and Jerusalem only fell in 597, and Joel actually prophesied around about 740, 750 BC, and his anticipation was the fall of the northern kingdom by the Assyrians, and he wouldn't have related to this fall of Jerusalem. He didn't even know that Jerusalem fell. He would have died long before then. And then next, the temple and houses would be destroyed. That's first mentioned by Amos, that the sanctuaries would be laid waste. Amos 7-9 and 9-1, Isaiah 13:16, Jeremiah 13:9, Zechariah 14:2, Daniel 9:27, Revelations 13:5-7. So they use those elements in Daniel's in Amos, and carried these forward to a later time. And then the element of the bodies being left where they die for the beast and the birds to consume, that wasn't written of by Amos or Hosea. But we find that after the Assyrian attack, and I've read certain books on this about the warfare, and they were really cruel. They used to cut people's body parts off and then throw them in heaps, and they would die and suffocate, and they would sometimes cut all their heads off and put them in piles, and they would leave them out there for the birds to eat. And Jeremiah knew of this and had a fixation with it, and mentions about 8 times in Jeremiah that these dead bodies would be left for the birds to eat. And then, of course, subsequent prophets spoke of that, and eventually it found its way into the book of Revelation. So we see clearly that they took these elements and put them into their expectations for the future. And Amos speaks of people going into exile, and of course that happened, and that a remnant would return. And we find many of these passages on the returning of the Israelites from captivity were actually written ex post facto back into their foundation documents, and we cover that in the prophets. And we show how there's scores of these ex post facto prophecies. What happened, they rewrote their history, and they wrote elements in there as if they were prophetic, but they were known that it was written in hindsight. For instance, that they would be in Egypt for 400 years, that eventually kings would come from them, that eventually their temple would be built, and that also eventually they would backslide, and when they repented, they would come back to their nation. And all of those elements were written ex post facto. Even the names of the tribes in Canaan, when they when they were told to eliminate the Jebusites, the Hivites, the Hittites, the Amorites, etc., etc. And those sort of names became almost like a rhyme, and they mentioned it time and again. And we showed clearly that those nations were only exposed to them, and they only knew of them when they settled into the land. But right from the beginning, they show that God wanted them to eliminate those peoples and clear them out of the land. And that was all written ex post facto. And we show that clearly in the beginnings. The second major book on prophetic utterances, we show Ezekiel. And there were many problems with Ezekiel. And we show, and many of the commentaries show that Ezekiel was edited by the prophets, by the school of the prophets, and that they changed many of the elements within Ezekiel. And then we show clearly that Josephus speaks of there being 2 scrolls of Ezekiel during his time. And what happened is that after Josephus's time, these 2 rolls were joined together, and the book was edited, and the section from 38 to the end of Ezekiel was written by the school of the prophets, and we show linguistic evidence for that. And one of the things in Ezekiel that they wanted to show, and this whole thing of the Lord being occupying the actual tabernacle in the wilderness and then occupying their temple, we show that was a fabrication created during the Babylonian captivity, because the Babylonians believed that their temples were built by the gods, in other words, from a godly design, and they believed that their gods took their seat in the innermost sanctuary of their temples. And when they rewrote their writings in the Babylonian captivity, they didn't want to show they were lacking in their religious experience, and they wanted to at least equal what was shown by the Babylonians and to show better than what the Babylonians showed. And this was the case, and we showed there was no elaborate tabernacle in the wilderness. There was a tent of meeting, and there was an ark of the covenant without the cherubim on the lid, and we show all those things in the book, The Beginnings. But they wanted to show that God was resident in their temple, and we showed clearly that with the dedication of the temple through Solomon, that he had no notion that God was in the temple. He wrote and he said that this temple would never be able to contain you. And when we pray, we want you to hear our prayer from your abode in heaven, and we want you to answer our prayers as we pray. And we see that Solomon states that clearly, and that they didn't have a notion of God being permanently in their temple. It was only during the Babylonian captivity that they developed that, because that's what the Babylonians believed, and they wanted to show at least something comparable to that and better. And we show that when they returned from captivity, they wrote those books, the Chronicles. And in Chronicles they show, and they state, God, return from your throne and come and take up your abode on the Ark of the Covenant. And that was written well after they returned from their captivity. So we see their issues with Ezekiel, major issues. It was actually edited. And there's a book by Ingrid Lilly, the 2 books of Ezekiel, and she takes texts from the Dead Sea Scrolls of Ezekiel and shows that there were actual 2 accounts of those books, and we can see clearly it was rewritten. And the second section was written by the school of the prophets, and that whole section about the Lord returning to the temple and placing his feet there, and that was all written to as part of their survivalist strategy. And it wasn't spoken by God, and God's not going to be coming back and living in a physical temple here, and he's never lived in a physical temple. And what we show is that by them stating that they had exclusive rights to God, that they were limiting who God was, and that God was actually working with various peoples, and that he was working with the missionaries of Jove, that he was working with the followers of Dios Pater, and many of these different cosmologies, and that the Israelites weren't the only people of God in the world, and that there were other people, and that God has been ministering to people of all races since time immemorial. And Messiah alludes to that by saying that one must be born from above to see the kingdom of heaven. And in that way, people have all been born from above over the millennia. So the major issues with Ezekiel, and we show one of the problems with Ezekiel, that most of his bona fide prophecies were taken from prior prophets. And we draw up a schedule and we show all these things he wrote, and we show where he got these from. And for instance, Ezekiel speaks of the day of the Lord as having taken place as Jeremiah did. That's in Lamentations 2:16 to 17, 2:22, also Ezekiel 13:1-5. And we also show Ezekiel's replacing the heart of stone and being given a new spirit with a heart of flesh was taken from Jeremiah 31:31-34. And also Ezekiel writes of the land of milk and honey being sworn to the Israelites, which was stated as in Ezekiel 26 and 15, was styled on Jeremiah's depiction of this in Jeremiah 11 verses 1-5. And we show clearly that this Jeremiah, in his stating that a land had been sworn to them, and he says that has become a land of milk and honey, that during the Babylonian captivity, the priests latched onto that and wrote that back into their foundation documents and speak of this land of milk and honey and the land that was promised to them. And we show where Jeremiah actually got that from Exodus, I think it's 19:5 and 6. And we show clearly that there's no land promised there. It states if they will be obedient and that they will serve the Lord, then they'll become a kingdom of priests to the nations that are round about them. And we see there's no promise of a land that was given to them. And then, of course, Jeremiah speaks that it has become a land of milk and honey. In other words, initially, it wasn't a land of milk and honey. And they took that and they used that to try and show that God promised them this land, which we show wasn't the case. So we see that Ezekiel copied many of these prophetic utterances from prior prophets, and we put a schedule of that, and we showed that the two scrolls of Ezekiel became one book, and it was clearly written by the school of the prophets, and it was written with a survivalist agenda to it. And then we show that, which we've also touched on, that the school of the prophets created the departure of the Spirit of God from the temple to show that their God indwelt their temple, just as the Babylonians believed concerning their temples. And we believe that didn't actually take place. We showed that Ezekiel was actually a disturbed person who displayed all the signs of suffering from schizophrenia. And Ezekiel was dysfunctional, had to be tied down by his family and to prevent him from being a spectacle. And we see that at Ezekiel 3:25-26. We notice when his wife died, he couldn't shed a tear and he had emotional problems. Ezekiel 24:15-16. And we show too that this supposed vision that he had with the shattering instruments and the angels that were going to kill all the idolaters in Jerusalem at that time. We believe it was possibly written in there by the priests in showing that the Spirit of God departed. But we show that those angels were the shattering instruments, that it never occurred. And we see that when Jeremiah, when he was leaving Canaan after the fall of Jerusalem, that he actually met these women on the way to Egypt. And it's Jeremiah 44:15-19. And these people, these unbelievers from Jerusalem, were still very much alive, showing that these angels didn't go out and shattered everybody. And that's not how God operates. And we've shown that God isn't El Gibor, but God is a lover of people. So all these signs displayed by Ezekiel, his dysfunctionality, is a sign that he suffered from schizophrenia. And we've looked at and we placed various texts here in the book from certain medical journals showing that those are the signs of schizophrenia, and that Ezekiel displayed those signs. And also Ezekiel used very lewd descriptions of God's relationship with Israel, and he shows them committing a sexual act with when she was a maiden, and then goes on to speak about the Israelites running after the Egyptians because they had enlarged genitalia and literally lusted after Egypt. They had genitalia like donkeys and seminal emissions of horses. So very lewd descriptions. And we notice, and we've seen in various books, and we've provided quotes, that many of the Israelites early on, they actually lobbied to have his work removed from the Tanakh, and they didn't believe it was inspired. So the major issues with Ezekiel, and we state that he actually became more famous for his antics rather than what he wrote as prophecy. For instance, he lay on his side for 390 days and only ate certain prescribed vegetables cooked on a fire made with human excrement. Ezekiel 4:6 and 9. And then he shaved off his hair and beard and was to burn 1/3 in the city, and then to chop up another third to scatter around the city, and the remaining third to scatter to the wind. And he was to put some of the hair in the edges of his robe and throw some in the fire. All these antics. And eventually he became notorious for all these things. And they regarded him as prophetic. And as such, the School of the Prophets wrote that second scroll of Ezekiel, and they edited his work to make it more acceptable, and then later joined the two together. And that's what we have today. We also show that Zechariah, he was a post-exilic prophet and ministered 520 BC. That's after they returned from exile. And that Zechariah actually had various bona fide prophecies. He prophesied that Messiah would enter Jerusalem on the foal of a donkey, which was fulfilled by Messiah. And when he entered in the last week of his earthly ministry, he entered with shouts to Hosanna to the Son of David, and that happened. So Messiah riding on a donkey actually took place. He also speaks of the covenant of God coming to an end, and then said that they would portray him for 30 pieces of silver. And he showed that speaks of the covenant of God with the Israelites coming to an end, with them paying 30 pieces of silver for his services, and that it will be used for the potter's field, which relates to the death of Messiah, and that actually took place. So there were prophecies, bona fide prophecies mentioned by Zechariah. But we see also in our research of Zechariah, we see that he took bona fide prophecy and borrowed this largely from other prophets, and combined these prophecies with speculation as other prophets did. In other words, he put these together, but he didn't put them in a way that they actually unfolded, showing that he was using speculation and bona fide prophecy, which is mentioned actually in the book. And an example of that is Zechariah speaks of a fountain being opened in Jerusalem for the cleansing on the day of the Lord, Zechariah 13:1-2, i.e. when the armies are defeated, where sin will be cleansed, and then speaks of Messiah receiving the wounds in his arms where he was wounded in the house of his friends, Zechariah 13:6. So we see that Zechariah and his colleagues combined Psalm 22, Isaiah 5:3, and other texts to produce their expectation, and can clearly seen that he has coupled this with the day of the Lord, with the armies coming against Israel and the death of Messiah in the same event, Zechariah 13:1-6 and then to 9. So we see that he was bona fide, but he was also speculating. And we see clearly that chapter 14, and it speaks of all these apocalyptic events and the Mount of Olives and all these different things. And you can even see from the language he uses that he's actually speculating. In other words, it's as if he was drawing a chart and putting the chart up and putting all these expectations. And we've shown that many of those events won't happen, and that Jewish Apocalypticism was orchestrated from the time of Amos. So we see all of those, and we put those all in the book, and you can clearly see that there are issues to various things. And so that was the origination of Jewish Apocalypticism. That's fraught with problems, and even the books themselves have got problems, and later we'll see that some of these writings are ex post facto and definitely speculation, and that they aren't from God. So we're going to finish the first chapter over there, and just a reminder that these books can be obtained from Amazon.com and bookbaby.com, and just do a search under Ernest Austin Adams. Thank you for watching.